Chapter 7 video lecture. Now before we start on Chapter 7, which will be bones, before we get started, just a quick reminder, which is true for all of the other chapters. If there is a ancillary, a handout for example, available for a given chapter, then you need to look under the Modules section of Eagle Online under Instructors Resources. So if there are handouts that I have that are outside of what the publisher offers, then those outside handouts will be available under Modules, Instructors, Resources section. For example, this chapter that we're now on for bones, you will find several handouts. One of them is titled Bone Growth, and the other one is titled something like Ossification. So do look for those handouts. Now these handouts will be shown during conferences. So the handouts will be shown during the conferences. Okay, let's go ahead and get started with Chapter 7. Now the first thing we need to remember is that bone is a type of tissue. And if you recall from a previous chapter that bone is actually part of the connective tissue category. Right? So bone is really part of connective tissue. So all the words that we used in the connective tissue category, words like matrix, okay, words like fibers, all of those things will come back. Now let's go ahead and get started with this slide. First we see something important, which is at the very bottom here. It says continuously rebuilds and remodels itself. Well, bone remodels as a lifelong process. So bone remodeling is a lifelong process. Now it does involve several things. So bone remodeling does involve chemicals. So that's where your calcium, your phosphorus is going to come into play. It will also be playing a role with hormones like parathyroid hormone, calcitonin, as we'll see in this chapter. So hormones will play a role. It will also play a role in the type of bone cells, because we have osteoclast with a C, which breaks down the bone, and then we have osteoblast with the B, which actually helps build the bone. And the way I exaggerated those terms, that's how you need to remember them. So osteoclast with the C will break down bone. Osteoblast with the B will build bone. And all of this is a process of remodeling. It's a lifelong process. Okay, now we can continue. Okay, so in this slide right here, we are going back and talking about things with connective tissue. See how it says bones, cartilage, ligament. These are all things, and notice here down here it even says other CT. Well, what do you think that CT stands for? Connective tissue. So bone is a form of connective tissue. It's a very rigid connective tissue, unlike cartilage, which is more flexible. Okay, that takes care of that chapter, or that section. Next slide, we have compact bone. Now this is going to be important for a test. Compact bone is more of your true bone. When someone says true bone, they're talking about compact bone. They sometimes even call it dense bone. So dense bone, compact bone. Again, notice it talks about dense connective tissue. And notice it makes up most of the bone mass as well. Whereas at the bottom, I have spongy bone, which often goes by a name called cancellous bone. These terms you do want to be aware of because they are used interchangeably on exams. So spongy bone is cancellous bone. Some people even call it the trabecular bone, because you'll see a word in a little while called the trabecule, which is a triangular shape or a diamond shape. Now the spongy bone or cancellous bone, or this trabecular bone, is really more like spongy bone or more like cartilage. Okay, so a spongy bone or cancellous bone is more like cartilage. Next slide. Okay, speaking of cartilage, we have plain old cartilage here. Now there's something that you should have remembered from the previous section. Cartilage is the only connective tissue that's actually poor in blood supply. Remember, connective tissue is normally rich in blood supply, like bone. Bone is rich in blood supply. But cartilage was one of the exceptions to the rule, where cartilage was the only connective tissue that was actually poor in blood supply. So be aware of that. Then we have down here the types of cartilage. So we're going to go through them one by one. The first one is called hyaline cartilage. Now it will play a role in bone growth, so we'll see that later. So hyaline cartilage will play a role in bone growth. And the hint is down here at the bottom, growth plates. So hyaline cartilage will play a role in bone growth. Okay, next one. The next one is fibrocartilage. This one really plays a role in your vertebrae, but it also plays a role in bone repair. Bone repair. So when you break a bone, fibrocartilage will play a role in bone repair. Then we have ligament. You should know this from a previous section, but I'm restating it again. Ligaments join bone to bone. So ligaments join bone to bone. Tendons connect muscle to bone. Okay. All right. So ligaments are bone to bone. Tendons are muscle to bone. Very, very important. Okay. Then we have here a picture, many books have this, showing you that as a child, more of your long bones are red bone marrow. So as a child, you're going to have more of your bone marrow filled with red bone marrow. Now, red bone marrow plays an important role in hemo, and some people call it hemato, same thing, hemo or hematopoiesis, which is the making of the red blood cells. Now, the object here, however, is not just red blood cells. That's a misnomer. It's not only red blood cells. It's red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. Okay, so they call it hemopoiesis or hematopoiesis, which deals with red blood cells, but it's also the red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. So you make more of that as a child because more of your bones are red bone marrow early on. Later on, as you become an adult, it is replaced with yellow bone marrow, and the yellow bone marrow will be for storage of adipose tissue or fat. So here in this picture, we see a lot of blue areas, and these blue areas are going to be for hyaline cartilage. And these happen to be locations where bone growth will occur. So these blue areas will be where bone growth will occur. Okay, next slide. Okay, this is a general basic functioning of bone. We have support and protection. We have movement. We have that word I mentioned a moment ago, hemopoiesis or hematopoiesis, which is the making of red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. And then we have the storage of minerals and energy reserves. This is where your calcium comes into play. This is where your phosphate or phosphorus comes into play. This is also where your triglyceride storage will be in the form of fat. The author is now going to take a moment to break it down for you, and that's what they've done here for support and protection. So that's why you have a hard head to protect the little brain underneath, that kind of thing. Then for movement, remember our muscles do not move unless our bones make them move. Then we have the muscles again mentioned, muscles and bones working together. Then we have the hemopoiesis or hematopoiesis. So hemopoiesis or hematopoiesis, it's the red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. Okay. Then for mineral storage, I already talked about the calcium. I already talked about the phosphorus or phosphate, and also the triglycerides and lipid storage right here at the bottom in the yellow bone marrow of adult bones. So we replace more of the red bone marrow to yellow bone marrow as we become adults. Okay. So these slides are of value to you. Okay. Then comes the 4 classes of bones, and they're all determined by the shape. So we have long bone, short bone, flat bone, irregular bone. There is one more not mentioned in this book or in this slide, and that is sesamoid. Sesamoid. Your kneecap, your patella, so your kneecap, your patella is sesamoid because it looks like a sesame seed. So sesamoid. Now, Nimish, what do I have to do for your lecture and the lab class? You're going to have to put your bones that you learn in class and put them and classify them accordingly. So many of the skull bones, for example, are flat bones. So the sphenoid, the temporal bone, those are flat bones. Then your vertebrae, for example, will be irregular bones. Then your femur, your your femur, your tibia, your fibula, those would be long bones. And then the bones of your wrist, for example, would be short bones. Okay? So that's what you're going to have to do. It's going to be for lab as well as for lecture. Okay? And many authors have a picture like the one I'm on now, showing you the bones of the skull, for example, being flat bone, the vertebrae being irregular, your tibia, fibula, that type of thing will be femur, even will be long bone, and then the bones of the ankle or the bones of the wrist will be the short bones. So you need to be able to classify them. Again, the 5th one was sesamoid, which is your patella or your kneecap. All right, I'm going to skip this because I'd rather do it in picture form, but these slides I'm skipping right now are of value. I'm only skipping them because it's best to show it in the form of a picture. So here you see the medulla or the medullary cavity, which I've mentioned is more red bone marrow in children, and then in the adult it would be more yellow bone marrow. So I'm now going to go to the picture that goes with this. Again, this slide is also of importance, but I'm skipping, again, same is true here, but I'm skipping to, and same is true here, and I'm skipping to the picture. So again, let me backtrack to make sure we got it all. So this one is of value, 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 and I'm going to describe it using this picture. I'm going to start at the very, very top. At the very, very top, which will be the end of the bone, on the end of the bone, I have articular cartilage. You'll see it at the very top, and you'll also see it at the very, very bottom. So on the end of the bone, I have articular cartilage. Then, going back to the top again, I have now a term that describes the end of the bone. The end of the bone is called epiphysis. You have a proximal end, and of course at the very bottom you have a distal end as well. So the end of a bone, either top end or the bottom end, the ends of the bone are called epiphysis. So we have the proximal end, which is proximal epiphysis, and we have the bottom, which is the distal end, which is distal epiphysis. And then what do I find on the end of the bone? Articular cartilage. Okay, the next thing. Notice I have another little subset between the epiphysis and the diaphysis, I have something called metaphysis. Now, metaphysis is important because that is where you're going to find something called the epiphyseal line. So the metaphysis contains the epiphyseal line. Now, before it became the epiphyseal line, it was called epiphyseal plate. Now, some people say, is that the growth plate that they keep talking about? That is correct. So the epiphyseal plate is your growth plate, which eventually, around the age of, say, 17, 18, 19, so around 17, 18, 19 years of age, the epiphyseal plate becomes the epiphyseal line. After that point, there is no more longitudinal or lengthening of the bone. So you can't grow any taller than that because it has now closed. So epiphyseal plate will become epiphyseal line around age 17, 18, 19. That will stop the linear or longitudinal growth of that bone. So here is where I am in the picture. Epiphyseal plate, epiphyseal line. Now, all this little airy space up here is part of what's called spongy bone. Remember I said that's also called cancellous bone or the trabecular bone because it has like diamonds or triangle shapes in there. Now this bone here is sort of a flexible bone, bendable bone. It is actually what diverts the weight onto the hard, compact bone. So the first load-bearing part of your bone would be the spongy bone that diverts the weight onto the compact bone. So if we look at the picture here, we see the outer part here is compact bone and more of the inner part is spongy bone. Then we have our medullary cavity. And in this example, since we're dealing with an adult bone, we see more of a yellow bone marrow since we're dealing with the adult bone in this picture. All right, so we have our spongy bone. Then working outward, I would have a compact bone. And this term that I'm on now, it's called endosteum. That's actually the lining just next to the medullary cavity. So right next to the medullary cavity, you would have endosteum. Think of it as a sheet of paper that you turned into a tube. So if you take a sheet of paper and you turn that sheet of paper into a tube, the lining, that inner lining, would be called endosteum. And then the space of that tube, that center space of that tube, would be called medullary cavity. That should help you visualize it. So the space in the middle is medullary cavity, and then the lining of that paper that you've turned into a tube, the inner lining is the endosteum. Okay, then I go to this word here, diaphysis. That is the length or the main shaft of the bone. Notice where it is. The diaphysis is between the metaphysis at one end and the metaphysis at the other end. So the main shaft of the bone is diaphysis. Okay? So the main shaft of the bone is diaphysis. Now, a lot of people think that we add pieces to the end and make the end grow longer. No, what we really do is we add to the diaphysis. So the diaphysis grows longer and longer and longer. Let me give you an example of that. If you have a nice fancy dining table, many of these fancy dining tables have a little middle section, and then they have pieces just off the middle section that you can remove, and you can squeeze the ends of the table closer to the middle and have a smaller table. And when relatives come over for Thanksgiving or whatnot, Christmas or whatnot, then what do? Is you unlatch the little latch at the bottom of the table, you open up the ends and move the ends away, and then you start adding leaves, the wooden leaves that go to. And what are you really doing by adding the wooden leaves? You're making the diaphysis longer. And that's exactly what we're doing here. So when the bone grows longer, we're actually making the diaphysis longer as well by adding to the diaphysis. So when we have our metaphysis up here and the metaphysis at the bottom, when we grow, the metaphysis is actually adding on and adding on and adding on to the diaphysis and making the diaphysis grow longer. Okay, now let's go back to our next term. Periosteum. That's the term I'm on now. Periosteum. Now the periosteum is the outer covering of the bone. Sort of like a bark on a tree. So like a bark on a tree, the periosteum is the outermost covering of the bone. That's the periosteum. Now this periosteum is going to play a role in the girth. G-I-R-T-H. Now the word girth means the thickness of the bone. So the periosteum will play a role in the girth or thickness of the bone. Okay. Next term is nutrient artery. Your bones are actually starting off in a form of a cartilage. And as we said, cartilage is poor in blood supply. So somehow we have to turn this cartilage-like thing that we start off with into real bone, and we do that by feeding it with a blood vessel. And that blood vessel that we first get everything started with is called nutrient artery. And we'll see better pictures of that later. Okay, so that right there is a mass information about this picture, and it's related to these slides that I've intentionally skipped, but are worthy, and that's why I keep showing them to you back and forth. Okay, so these terms are important for a test. Okay, moving on. I've already talked about periosteum, so I'm going to let that go. Here's periosteum again, but I have a better picture later that I'll be describing. So again, the outermost covering of your bone is periosteum. So the outermost covering, very much like a bark on a tree. Okay, we can move forward now. Endosteum, I already described using that sheet of paper example. So that's all you need to know there. This one I don't care. Don't care. Don't care. Okay, now, we already know that bones are very rich with blood supply. We've said that several times. We also talked about that nutrient artery. Excuse me. Pardon me. So we've already talked about that nutrient artery. We talked about the bones being very rich in blood supply, only cartilage being the exception. Okay. Bones do have a lot of nerves. Just FYI there, I don't really care too much about that. We've already talked about the red bone marrow. Red bone marrow is for the red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. Children would have more of the red bone marrow in their long bones. Adults would more have of the fatty tissue. So we've already talked about this. We've already talked about this too, that in adults we have more yellow bone marrow for storage of fat, and we're converting it a little bit as needed. So I don't care. I really don't care about this clinical question. Okay, this one I do care. Now, on this slide, we have 4 types of bone cells. 4 types of bone cells. I'm going to describe each of them, and then there's going to be a picture that shows it as well. The first one is called osteoprogenitor cell. Osteoprogenitor cell. Some people in some books call it osteogenic cell. Same thing. So osteoprogenitor or osteogenic. Same thing. Now, this osteoprogenitor gives rise to osteoblasts. So osteogenic cells will eventually give rise to osteoblast. Now you heard me say this at the beginning of today's video. Osteoblast, it has a B there. Osteoblast builds bone. So osteoblasts are the bone cells that will build bone. They're going to lay down new matrix. And notice I'm using words from the connective tissue chapter. And again, you see it at the top here too. Matrix. It's going to lay down the minerals. It's going to create the fibers. It's going to make the bone strong. And if you recall from the connective tissue chapter, a matrix is really ground substance and fibers. Remember that from the connective tissue chapter. So that's what the osteoblast is going to lay down. It's going to lay down the minerals, and the minerals in our case is going to be calcium primarily, and the fibers as well to hold everything in place. So that's osteoblast. Now what happens is that over time the osteoblast gets stuck in its own matrix. Now what I mean by that is you're laying down concrete. You know how some foolish guy is laying down concrete, but he doesn't do it from the inside of the room, for example, up to the doorway so you can leave, but rather he starts sweeping the floor or putting down the concrete from the doorway, the only door exit that he has, and laying it all the way down to the back wall. So now he's stuck in his own mess that he's put together. Well, that's what happens to an osteoblast. An osteoblast eventually gets stuck, sort of like concrete, gets stuck in its own gook that he laid down. Now when that happens, these osteoblasts change over and become osteocytes. Okay, so osteoblasts become osteocytes. So osteoblast will become osteocytes. Many books will even say that it got stuck in its own matrix, okay, or it's bound in its own matrix. Okay, well, that's what they're talking about. Osteoblasts getting stuck within their matrix, now called osteocytes. They're still alive. They still do what they need to do, but they're stuck. Okay. Now, the last one down here is osteoclast. It does not belong to numbers 1, 2, and 3 there on the screen. This is a separate story. So number 4, osteoclast, is separate. Now notice I said osteoclast with the C there. The spelling counts, right? Osteoclast. Well, that C tells me it's going to destroy the bone. So osteoclast will play the role in breaking down the bone. Now how does it do that? It does it two ways. Osteoclast uses enzymes. Now what do you think the enzymes will break down? It will break down the protein fibers, the collagen fibers. So the enzymes are for the collagen fibers. Right? Collagen is a protein. So it's going to break down the collagen fibers. It's also going to use HCl, hydrochloric acid. Now the hydrochloric acid is to break down the ground substance, which will be calcium. Calcium. Now let's take a look at what happens if one is broken down and not the other. Many textbooks have a paragraph, or some even have a picture, showing where they take a bone and they take a live bone, a real bone, and put it in vinegar. Now vinegar is of course an acid, right? Acetic acid, vinegar. Vinegar is acetic acid. If you put real bone in a vinegar bath and then take it out, you're going to find that the bone becomes very, very flexible, and you can even tie it into a little bow knot. That's what old movies used to show. Okay. Now, why is that? Because by having it in a vinegar, in an acid like hydrochloric acid, you've etched away all of that calcium, all that mineral. And all you're left with is the collagen fiber. And the collagen fiber is now very, very flexible. And that's why you're able to take a bone that's been leached of all the minerals, the calcium, the ground substance, and now all you're left with is the collagen fiber that can now bend the bone easily. Now what if you went the other way? What if you used these enzymes I talked about and only the enzyme? Then what will happen is that the collagen fibers will disappear. The collagen will go away and be broken down, and you're going to be left with a powder. And that powder is going to be your calcium minerals, your ground substance. So that's why it's important to understand that two things are coming from the osteoclast. Enzymes to break down the collagen fibers, and the hydrochloric acid to break down the minerals, the calcium, the ground substance. Okay, next slide. Okay, I already gave you this. I said eventually they become osteocytes. There's a typo there. Eventually they become osteocytes. Here are the osteocytes again. Remember, they came from osteoblasts. Then as a separate story, we have osteoclast, and they're going to break down the bone. And this term right here at the bottom, resorption or reabsorption, that's basically breaking down the bone. Here's a picture that is in many books showing you the differences. Up here on the far left, top left, we have the osteoprogenitor turning into an osteoblast, and then eventually getting stuck in its own matrix and turning into osteocyte. And see how it says maintains bone matrix, turns into osteocyte. Then as a separate story, you see here an osteoclast. To me too, it looks like a suction cup. And then you have the enzymes and the hydrochloric acid from underneath that suction cup to break down the bone. Okay, this slide is basically what we have already come across. So I've said these things, you just didn't get it yet, but here it is. Collagen protein, right? So collagen protein will be your fibers. Then there's proteoglycan, glycoproteins. Remember these terms? Proteoglycans, glycoproteins were under ground substance in the connective tissue chapter video. Well, these are going to be our calcium, our minerals. So our minerals. And that's what our bones are really made out of. It's got the organic part and the inorganic part. And then this is now playing a role here showing you how this is going to be dealing with flexibility and stretchability. When I go to the next slide, this slide right here, we have the inorganic. This is where our calcium will be. Now the one you need to know for sure for a test is this term in bold, hydroxyapatite. That is the actual form of calcium within our bones. And again, I said that it's the calcium, the rigidity, the strength of the bone, the hardness of the bone. The hardness is coming from the calcium. So this is important. Again, hydroxyapatite is the calcium form in our bones. So it's not just plain old calcium that you see on the periodic table. It's hydroxyapatite. Okay. Don't really care for this slide. Okay. Then we have this word here, calcification. Now when I go through this chapter, you're going to hear me say 3 shuns. When I say 3 shuns, I'm talking about 3 words that are going to end with T-I-O-N. So here's our first one called calcification. That's when we actually put the minerals and convert the minerals of calcium and phosphorus and phosphate into hydrocarbons. oxyapatite. And that will be called calcification. So we're going to have 3 shuns: calcification, mineralization, and there's one later on. Okay, so here's information about that. This is a good slide to keep in mind. Okay, this is the opposite story, and I've already shared with you this information too. I told you that we're going to dissolve the minerals using hydrochloric acid, and we are going to break down the collagen fibers with the protein enzymes. So that's mentioned here. Okay. And that's how osteoclasts work. They use enzymes to break down the collagen, and they use the hydrochloric acid to break down the minerals. Okay, don't care for that one. Okay, I do care for this information, but we're going to do it a better way, so we're going to pass that up. Passing this up too. All of these slides, and I do not like the idea of people copying slides all day, so the slides are always available to you. Okay, so the slides are available to you from the official PowerPoint, and you always have this lecture video available as well. So I really want to focus on the pictures. Okay, so all of these terms are available to you, and I'm focusing on the picture. Not this one's too small. Not this one either. It's coming up, but this slide's important as well. So is this one. And this is the picture that is important. And your textbook has a picture similar to this. Now, in this picture, we first have to get our bearings. So let's go from left to right and look at stuff that we've already learned. So as I go from left to right, the first thing I see is the periosteum. And we've already said that the periosteum is the outer covering of the bone, like the bark of a tree. So that's what this is, the periosteum. Then just underneath the periosteum, we have this layer. And how do I know it's a layer is because of that word there that starts with an L, the lamellae. Lamellae simply means layer, like laminated. Something that's laminated is layered. Well, that's why it's called lamellae. And that one right here is called the circumferential lamellae. You will need to know that, especially for the lab, if nothing else. So circumferential lamellae. That's this thing right here, circumferential lamellae. That's that band that's going around just underneath the periosteum. Circumferential lamellae. Then we have these little circles here. Each unit is called an osteon. So each unit is called an osteon. Now earlier, and I'm going to back up here, you're going to see a term called the Haversian system. Okay, the Haversian system. This is an old name for osteon. Okay, so the Haversian system is just an old name for that. All right, so that's an osteon. Now the osteon is the basic structural, functional unit of compact bone. I'll say that again. An osteon is the basic structural, functional unit of compact bone. Now, what makes up the osteon itself? The osteon itself has a type of lamellae called concentric. You won't be able to see that one in here so well yet. I'll show that in another slide. So the osteon itself has the concentric lamellae. So the osteon itself has concentric lamellae. Now between the osteons, there's one there, osteon there, osteon there. In between the osteons, we have something called interstitial lamellae. So in between the osteons is interstitial lamellae. Then we have right here is the cutoff for the compact bone. Then we have our spongy bone. And remember it said trabecule, and I told you the trabecule is sort of like the triangular shape. And then right over here where the cursor is bouncing almost in the white space, that would be the medullary cavity. So right in this white space would be the medullary cavity. Right there in the white space. Then if I go back to our osteon, inside the osteon we have our blood vessels and nerves. And that's called the central canal. So each osteon in the center has a central canal with blood vessels and nerves. Okay. Right, so each osteon in the center, we have a central canal with blood vessels and nerves. Now, if you look at the osteon, the way it's done, it's sort of like a telescope, tube within a tube within a tube. And that's what I said a moment ago that I can't show you properly yet, but it's called a concentric lamellae. And are you telling me in the image that each one of these tubes spins in a different direction? Well, look carefully. How this one spins more in a right turn, and this one spins more of a left turn. Right? This one goes towards the left, this one goes towards the right. So they're actually intertwined like that. So one layer is twisting in one direction, the other layer is twisting in the opposite direction. Now, let's go to the bottom here. There's a osteon right there with its central canal, and then there's another osteon over here with its central canal. And notice that they're joined together over here called perforating canal. So how the central canal of one osteon is connected to the central canal of another osteon through this perforating canal. Now if I go back a slide, you'll see that it has another name called Volkmann's canal. So Volkmann's canal or perforating canal is the joining of the central canal of one osteon to the central canal of another osteon. Okay, that takes care of this picture. And your textbook has a picture similar to that. Okay, this is something I couldn't show you in the other one, which now I can show you here. Here you clearly see one osteon where I see each tube of the osteon rotating in a different direction. So one's rotating to the left, one is to the right, one is to the left. Then I mentioned concentric lamellae, which I couldn't show you before, but now you can see it. Each of these rings make up the concentric lamellae. And then we have the central canal in the middle. Now these little spider-looking things, or roach-looking things, or bug-looking things, these are your osteocytes. Okay, these are your osteocytes. Remember, they used to be osteoblasts, but they got stuck, and now they're osteocytes. Now, each of these osteocytes have legs that stick out, and you can see the legs labeled here called caniculi. Since these osteocytes are stuck, how are they going to get their food? Well, it has to come to them, like special delivery. So the blood is over here. So the nutrients and everything has to flow across this bone surface. And then these caniculi, and to me, these caniculi are like straws. Okay, they're pretty much like straws. And these straws, these caniculi, are going to suck up the nutrients that are in this area. Now the boo-boo of the author here is that they've labeled this space right there lacuna. They should have backed it up a little bit. It's really the space between these two legs right here, for example. That would be the lacuna. So in between the legs is your lacuna. And a definition of lacuna is like a little pond. So it really should be between the legs here. So the caniculi are the straws, these legs, and they act like straws to suck up the nutrients around them, around in that lacuna. Okay, so here's your osteocyte. Next slide. Okay, I don't care too much for this one. Don't care. Okay, this one is worthy of making a note of. You should already know this. Hyaline cartilage, because it says it's cartilage, is going to be what? Avascular. Remember, cartilage lacks a blood supply. Okay, so hyaline cartilage has a poor blood supply. Okay, so just be aware of that. And again, hyaline cartilage will play a role with bone growth. Okay, now the only thing about this slide I care for is this term right here, chondrocytes. You should have already figured it out that chondrocytes are basically cartilage cells. That's the take home you got to get off of this slide. So chondrocytes are basically cartilage cells. Okay, I really don't care for this chart. Okay. All right, now this slide is important. Now remember I said that there are handouts available under modules on Eagle Online, under modules, under instructor resources. Well, I have provided a handout that goes with these two types of growths. So interstitial growth and appositional growth. So there are handouts that go with interstitial growth, appositional growth. Now you do need to know the definition that you see on the screen here. Growth in length. Growth in length is interstitial growth. And yes, there is a handout under modules, under instructors resources on Eagle Online. There is another handout when it goes with growth in width. And that has to do with appositional growth. Now, width is the same thing as that other word I spelled out for you, which is girth, G-I-R-T-H, that thickness. So appositional growth has something to do with the periosteum. So appositional growth will have something to do with the periosteum. And growth in length up here, interstitial growth, will have something to do with that metaphysis and that epiphyseal plate, epiphyseal line story we saw earlier. Okay, we'll continue. Now, in addition to the interstitial growth and the appositional growth, we have another concept called ossification. Now, ossification is one of those three shuns I mentioned. I said that we have calcification, mineralization, and now we have the third shun, which is ossification. Now, technically, there's a much more rich definition, but I wanted you to have a simple one. It's simply the conversion of soft, spongy bone into hard, compact bone. That is the definition you want to remember. So ossification is the conversion of soft, spongy bone into hard, compact bone. That is ossification. At the bottom of this slide, you see two forms of ossification. Intramembranous ossification and endochondral ossification. Both of these, one way or the other, regardless of how you start off, you're going to end up with hard, compact bone. Now, many books, again, do a poor job at this, so I've provided a handout under the module section, under the instructor resources, on the ossifications, both the intramembranous, and on the same handout, just a little bit further down, is one called endochondral ossification. You will want to know what the starting material is for each of them. This part, this ossification part of the story, most textbooks do pretty well. So I'll stick with it as I go along. But I do like my handout a little bit better because that's the one I've seen that clearly gets rid of all the miscellaneous things. So use the handout by far. Here we go. So the first one was intramembranous ossification. This is the one that has a starting material called mesenchyme. So intramembranous ossification starts off with mesenchyme. That's what I mean by knowing what the starting material is. And that's why I prefer my handout provided under the module section, instructor resources. Okay, so for intramembranous, the starting material is mesenchyme. Then, where do I find intramembranous? Notice I'm dealing with flat bones of the skull, the facial bones, the mandible, the clavicle. These are the only bones that undergo intramembranous. Basically your head, right? The flat bones of the skull, some of the facial bones, your jaw, your lower jaw, right? Mandible being your lower jaw, and then part of the clavicle. So these are the bones that undergo intramembranous ossification. So far I've given you a lot that goes with a test. You need to know the starting material for intramembranous ossification, which is mesenchyme, and what kinds of bones actually undergo this. All right, so that's important. Okay, then I don't care for this. Too many words. That's why I provided you with a picture to look at. So use that in the handout. Again, don't care for any of these. Here's what they have similar to it in the handout I've provided, where you create what's called an ossification center. That's what this is in the middle, the ossification. Now, what words do you see coming up here on this screen? Calcification. Well, that only happens when you put minerals in, so that's going to be mineralization as well. So whenever we have ossification, we have calcification and mineralization, and that ends up being my three shuns that I've mentioned, the 3TION, the three shuns. Calcification, mineralization, ossification. And here we are starting with mesenchyme, then creating an ossification center. This thing flattens out, and that's what gives us the flat bones of our skull. And you have a top ridge here, and remember it says periosteum, which is the outer part. Well, that eventually becomes the very top part. So that periosteum will eventually be the very, very top. Same as down here too, the very, very bottom. And then you'll have your compact bone, spongy bone in the middle, along with the blood vessels. So again, I prefer my handout a little bit better than this. Is a little bit too concise, squeeze into 4 quick slides. Okay, so be aware of it. You start with mesenchyme, create an ossification center. Notice only the ones in the middle became osteocytes. Only the ones in the middle became osteocytes. Notice all these are still what? Osteoblasts. So these are still osteoblasts. Still osteoblasts. Then only the ones in the middle turned into osteocytes. And then the ones that are going to be left alone will form a ridge. Now what about this stuff? What's the stuff at the top here? These at the top are called mesenchyme. And notice what happened to the mesenchyme that was way out here. That turned into the periosteum. So that is the kind of question they'll likely ask you. Matter of fact, it says it down here. Mesenchyme condenses to form the periosteum. And much of this is on my handout as well, where the outermost mesenchymes turned into the periosteum. Okay, so make sure you study this one or the handout that I've provided. Okay, now we do the other kind, the endochondral ossification. This is the one that you start off with a different model. Here you start off with the hyaline cartilage model. So when it comes to endochondral ossification, you're starting with a hyaline cartilage model. Okay, next slide. Don't care, too many words. Again, this is given to you in a handout form as well. All of this, too many words. They're available to you if you'd like to read through them, but I'm going to go through it as a picture. And this is the picture. Every book's got it. So every book's got it, and even the handout I've given to you is something like this. So here is my hyaline cartilage model that I start with. Notice it says perichondrium, not periosteum, perichondrium. So what do you think is going to happen? Perichondrium will turn into periosteum. Okay, so perichondrium will turn into periosteum. Then I'm going to have a blood vessel go in. Remember, that's my nutrient artery. My main nutrient artery goes in. That's going to create the first ossification center. So that's where you're going to build the bone first, in the middle. And then you're going to build the ends up. Then you're going to start building the ends. Now the ends are going to have hyaline cartilage, right? Hyaline cartilage. That's what's going to allow you to grow and grow and grow. But when you get to the age of 17, 18, 19-ish, the epiphyseal plate will turn into epiphyseal line. And then that way, no more new hyaline cartilage can grow. So if someone has an accident and the hyaline cartilage area right there fuses prematurely, then he's going to be a short person, or one leg will be shorter than the other, something like that, because there was a premature closing of the epiphyseal plate. Okay, and that would be a problem. Okay, next slide. Here's a continuation. So we've already finished the middle. Now we're working on the ends. There's your articular cartilage, which I said was on ON. Here we see the epiphyseal plate. And then as this is a young adult, and as a young adult, you now see that that word epiphyseal plate has turned into epiphyseal line. And remember, this epiphyseal plate, epiphyseal line is part of the metaphysis. So part of the metaphysis. And that means you have done what? You kept growing and adding and adding and adding to the diaphysis, making the diaphysis longer and longer as you grow taller and taller, older and older, and eventually the plate becomes a line and there's no more ways of adding to the diaphysis. So this is very similar to the one that's on my handout. I like the handout because it has a better description given to you. Okay, so that was now endochondral ossification. Okay, so this is what we've said so far. The author repeats it here. So bone growth in length was called interstitial growth. Bone growth in diameter was called appositional growth. And we have a constant bone remodeling. Okay. Now this is what goes on in the interstitial growth. This is part of my handout. So one of the handouts I've given you on interstitial growth is going to look like this. So it's going to have all these zones in it. Again, the words mean nothing unless you look at a picture along with it. So these are the words for the different zones. And then once all the zones are labeled for you, you now have a picture. This is a fair game picture that somebody would ask on a department exam, my exam. Okay, this is a fair game. So your textbook has a picture like this. My handout that I've provided has a picture like this. You will need to know the zones. And the way to get this is you got to get your bearing straight first. So notice this is the epiphyseal plate, but look what it says. This is the zone of ossification, and this is the zone of resting cartilage. So this must be the diaphysis up here, right? So you're actually going to grow into it. All right, so this is your epiphyseal plate. So make sure you get your bearing straight when you're working on it. Some books have it inverted depending on what direction of the end of the bone they're looking at. Okay, so be aware of how you're going to grow into the bone. And this is how we're hardening it down here. So we're adding to this portion. It rests here, grows here, gets even longer, and then down here is where we're adding more and more of the bone. Okay, next slide. Again, look at my handout for that. It does a really good job. I don't care for this slide. It's just a continuation. Okay, same is true here. Continuation. So all of this is mentioned in the handout provided also. So this is part of the handout. Let me go with this slide right here. Let me see if I pass out in this one. Epiphyseal plate. Be aware that if you have a growth, you can actually see whether you're going to grow more or not. And here's how they do that. In this picture, we see a hand of a child. And you can see outright that there is a little ridge right here, which is your epiphyseal plate. You can see them clearly in the other parts of the other bones as well. Like right there's a really clean one. That lets you know that this is a child's hand, yet still room to grow because of the epiphyseal plate. And all of this usually closes around ages 17, 18, 19 kind of thing. By then it's done. That's why sometimes an orthodontist will actually, a teeth doctor, an orthodontist will actually look at the kid's x-ray of a hand to get a feel for where he is in his growth development. Okay. All right, moving on. Okay, I don't care for that. Let me just double check something. Okay, so we're good to go forward. All right. I don't care. Okay, this is now the appositional growth. Again, there is a handout for this as well. So I like the handout better. Okay, this one I do want you to know as a clinical question called achondroplastic dwarfism. This is often due to a problem in the actual hyaline cartilage development. Notice it says here, inadequate endochondral ossification. That means this kid is going to be short. He's going to end up being a dwarf because there was a problem in the actual timing of the growth of that epiphyseal plate. So this is how they end up with achondroplastic dwarfism. Okay, so this one's important. Okay, remodeling. I've already said it at the very beginning that remodeling is a lifelong process. I said it a couple times. Well, this is the slide that goes with that. It's an ongoing process. Okay, it is influenced by hormones. So we're going to see that again. We're going to see that it's also involved by mechanical stresses. So, jumping up and down, physical fitness, pull and strains on the body versus being a couch potato and not having any mechanical stresses on the body. All that play a role in bone remodeling. That's what they figured out when they had astronauts go into space and not exercise while in space and saw how they lost their bones. So you can actually lose quite a bit of bone when you're in space. Okay, these are the mechanical stresses. They are both weight-bearing stresses and just basic exercise as well. And so they do know that you need to know that or have that. It also says gravitational forces. That's what I mean by astronauts. So in space, they figured out that you don't have much of a gravitational push or a pull on the bones. Therefore, you have a problem with properly growing while in space. It would not be a really good idea to send a little kid yet to space because we don't know what the problem will be in terms of overall development and growth for a kid in space. There's an extended version of the same thing about the stress again. So weight bearing, exercise, all of that. If you don't have much stress, then you're actually going to lose bone. So decrease bone mass if you don't have enough stress on your bones. So when the astronauts come back, they actually have a much of a osteoporosis kind of an effect on their bone structure. So even if you're a male and you're in prime age, you're still going to have osteoporosis effects even though you don't have the problem yet but because of not having enough mechanical stress, it'll do the same thing. Hormones will play a role in the bones as well. So hormones will play a role with the bones. The first hormone we're looking at is growth hormone. Now this slide to me here is an important one. So if you had to say of all the hormones you're about to talk about, Nimish, which two play the biggest role? Will be these two. Growth hormone and thyroid hormone will play the greatest influence on bone remodeling. So one more time. Growth hormone and thyroid hormone will play the greatest effect when it comes to hormones on bone remodeling or bone growth. Okay, so this is important. Notice both of these are playing a role right at the epiphyseal plate, affecting the bone growth, bone remodeling. Secondary would be these sex hormones like estrogen and testosterone. That would be a secondary effect. Okay, so estrogen and testosterone, like when puberty kicks around, that's going to be a secondary effect when it comes to sex hormones. Then third effect, so this is now a distant third, will be steroids like glucocorticoids or steroids like these. These would have a third degree. So first is going to be growth hormone and thyroid. Second will be the sex hormones for testosterone and estrogen. And then this would be the distant third. Okay, so the order in which the slides are going is a good way of remembering it for the test. Okay, next. Serotonin, again, that would be a distant one. Okay, now comes on hormones affecting how calcium operates. Now, one of the things you need to understand from what I'm about to go into is that it not only affects the bones, but it affects many other organ systems of the body, even in A&P2. So what we're doing now will show up even again in A&P2. Okay, so this slide here talks about why calcium is so important. This does get asked on a test. So this will be asked on a test. Calcium plays a role in muscle contraction. Calcium plays a role with neurons. Calcium will play a role with the heart. And calcium will play a role with blood clotting. The first two you'll see a little bit later in this course, and the last two you'll see in A&P2. Then the two primary hormones that deal with calcium is calcitriol and PTH. So calcitriol and PTH. Okay. Now, in order to understand how calcitriol comes about, you need to know where it came from. Now, this was something that was mentioned and talked about in the skin chapter, but it is restated again to make sure we got it. So your skin starts off with something called vitamin D3, and that is called cholecalciferol. So cholecalciferol, that is coming from the skin. So vitamin D3, cholecalciferol. Now, Nimish, is that the same vitamin D3 that's in our milk? Yes, because we don't know whether we're getting enough sunlight. So if you don't get enough sun, like you live in Alaska and you have the land of the midnight sun, where it's really dark most of the time, or light most of the time, well then you need to have some way to get your proper bone growth. So nature says, okay, if I don't get enough UV light, then I better get it through the milk, because we fortify our milk in America. So vitamin D3, cholecalciferol, it comes through our skin. Okay, so through our skin, through our UV light. Then eventually the liver plays a role, the kidney plays a role, and the kidney is what finally, and that's the slide I'm on now, the kidney finally converts it to calcitriol. That's important to remember. So the kidney will finally convert it to calcitriol. This is something that shows up again in A&P2. So the kidney will finally convert it to calcitriol. And the kidney calcitriol will do the following. It'll stimulate absorption of calcium from the small intestine into the blood. So you're going to raise your blood calcium level. That's what calcitriol will do. Raise the blood calcium level. Okay. So calcitriol will raise the blood calcium level. PTH, parathyroid hormone, also does the same thing. It raises the blood calcium level. So PTH and calcitriol's job is to raise the blood calcium level. And don't forget this statement here. Calcitriol is really the active form of vitamin D3. Okay, so this must be important. Since I like pictures, this is a picture version. Many books do not have this, so that is why I'm providing it here as part of our video. So here we see we either can get it through our milk, so we can either get it as a dietary supplement, or from the sun's rays, and we make vitamin D3, which is cholecalciferol. It finally goes through the liver, finally gets to the kidneys, and the kidney converts it to calcitriol. Okay. Next slide. This is now the story of PTH. Of course, by its very name, you know that the parathyroid hormone comes from the parathyroid gland. That's where the lab class comes into play, knowing where it is, the parathyroid gland. Okay. And this bottom part right here is what I said is very important. So let's look at this one carefully down here. It acts synergistically to increase the release of calcium from the bone into the blood. Now, what does that mean? You're actually leaching your bones. So you're taking the minerals, the calcium, out of your bone and putting it into your blood. And earlier I said that both PTH and calcitriol raise the blood calcium level. And that's exactly what it's doing. It raises the blood calcium levels. Nimesh, isn't that sometimes a bad thing? Because you're going to get too much of your calcium out of your bone, and your bone's going to get a little weaker. Well, that's exactly what happens when you get to the old age of osteoporosis. So when you have menopause as a female and you end up with losing a lot of calcium from your bones, it's because of PTH. So when you hit menopause, PTH is quite effective at removing the calcium from your bone and putting it into the blood. Look what the last line says. Increases the osteoclast activity. That means PTH works with osteoclast. So are you telling me that PTH will tell that osteoclast bone cell to break down even more bone and release more of the calcium into the blood? That's exactly what I'm saying. Okay, next slide. Okay, this is just a continuation. Make sure you read this. I've already summed up that same storyline. Here we're simply saying that the small intestine does the same thing. The small intestine will absorb more of the calcium from your intestines. And as you absorb more calcium from the intestines, you're putting it into the blood. So you're raising your blood calcium levels even more. Now, what is the bad thing about that? If your calcium levels in your blood are too high, it can cause a problem with your heart. And that is why women are likely to get heart attacks equal to men when they hit menopausal age. Okay, the next term I care for is this clinical one called rickets. Now, rickets is the same thing as osteomalacia. Listen to the term, I'll say it again. Osteomalacia. Osteomalacia occurs in the adult, whereas the rickets occurs in the child. It is the same thing. So if an adult has it, then it's called osteomalacia. And if a child has it, it is called rickets. And this is the problem that people in poor nations would have if they don't have enough vitamin D. And the reason why you need vitamin D is that's how calcium gets absorbed into your bloodstream. So without vitamin D, calcium is basically useless. So you can you can eat gallons and gallons of calcium tablets, and it's not really going to help you unless you have the vitamin D to help you absorb it into your bloodstream and deposit it into your bones. So that's why vitamin D is so essential. Matter of fact, nowadays you can't even find a calcium supplement that doesn't have the vitamin D added. So if you go look on the store shelves, you'll see calcium big print, calcium tablet, and then right in smaller print next to it, it says contains vitamin D. All right, or contains vitamin D3. Okay? That's why, because you have to have vitamin D to help you absorb your calcium as well. Okay, next. Now the opposite hormone is calcitonin. Now this comes from the thyroid. Okay, so calcitonin comes from the thyroid. It is the opposite of PTH. So calcitonin is the opposite of PTH. Okay? It also slows down osteoclast activity. So as long as calcitonin is doing its job, you're going to be able to prevent your bones from being broken down. But what do you think starts happening in older age? In older age, in osteoporosis times, PTH happens to be more effective, not calcitonin. So therefore you have a problem. Okay. So your only friend earlier in life is calcitonin because it blocks osteoclast activity and it also slows down the leaching of the calcium into your blood. It helps with bone deposition. That means it helps deposit the calcium into your bone. So it helps with bone deposition. And it will reduce the amount of calcium in your blood. So this slide is of value. This is a continuation. I don't really care for too much about that second part. Here's a nice picture version. So I would definitely study this one. This is the slide that I actually tell my A and P2 students to go back to. This is the slide I tell my A and P2 students to go back to because they forgot this in A and P2. Okay, so this is the picture I tell my A and P2 students to go back to as a reminder, as a refresher. So definitely study this picture. Okay, don't care. Don't care. Now, these slides here that I'm going over now are part of aging. So all the things that relate to aging. So yes, these slides will be of value. You should have a general idea of what happens to your bones when you age. So this is slide number 1 for that. Slide number 2. Slide number 3. Slide number 4. Okay, so those have to do with aging. Now we have bone fracture. So bone fracture. Okay. I'll tell you which ones are important in a moment. Okay, I'm going to go down this list and I'll tell you which ones are more likely to show up and are important for either your instructor or the department exam. So I'll start from the top and I'll call out the ones that are important. Here it goes. The first one is colds, C-O-L-L-E-S. The next one is communited. Communited. The next one is compound, also called open. The next one is compression. The next one after that is green stick. Green stick was the last one. The next one after that is impacted. The next one after that is pot. The next one after that is simple, also called closed. The next one after that is spiral. And the last one is stress. I'll repeat all of them one last time. We have colds, communited, compound, also called open, compression, green stick, impacted, pot, simple or closed, spiral, and stress. Those are the ones you're likely to see on the test. I would definitely put them as flashcards. Okay. Now, instead of doing all of these slides that you see here, when it comes to bone fracture repair, they're going to ask you about this picture. This picture. You have your fracture hematoma, which is broken blood vessels. Then the first thing that comes in is a framework using fibrocartilage. Remember I said fibrocartilage is involved in bone repair. So fibrocartilage will act as a scaffold. So it's going to act like a scaffold. It's going to form a soft bone. Then notice the language. It goes from soft to hard. So what kind of words are going to be used to go from soft to hard? It's going to be the three shuns. It's going to be calcification, mineralization, and ossification. And then you'll finally have bone remodeling. Now, when you break a bone, most situations are such that it leaves some kind of ridge there so that a doctor can in the future do an x-ray and see that you've actually broken that bone sometime in the past. But rarely it'll be such a clean cut healing that no remains are there to show a sign of a fracture repair. So when it comes to fracture repair, the story I just shared with you is plenty. You have the fracture hematoma, followed by a fibrocartilage framework. Then I'm going from soft to hard bone, which is going to be the three shuns: mineralization, calcification, ossification, and then finally the bone remodeling. Now remember, bone remodeling is all about the osteoblast, osteoclast constantly working. This is working forevermore. They're constantly making adjustments.